This week in our Java course, we're looking at loops. We're going to investigate the while loop, the for loop, and the do while loop. And we'll also look at sentinel value loops, which use the while loop. To begin, why do we loop? It's more efficient. It's quicker to get our instructions out because now we only need to write them once and they will happen as many times as we need. So there's less time for designing and coding, fewer errors, and the compile time is shorter too because it just compiles that one loop versus the same instructions over and over again. I'm sure this syntax for a while loop is a review from programming logic, but we have our keyword while all in lowercase and then opening and closing parentheses, and inside of that while loop will be our condition that we're going to test. And while that condition is true, the statements between the two curly brackets are going to execute. So each of the statements inside of the bracket will have parentheses at the end, and then at the end of our while loop altogether we do not have parentheses. So inside of that while loop, we've got to make sure that we've got a couple things taken care of so that our loop will end. The first thing is we need to make sure that we've got the value for the condition initialized before entering the loop. The testing happens inside of that while loop while the condition is true, and then inside of the loop we have to alter that loop control variable so that we can get a new value for our condition to check. We can control conditions in while loops with two different mechanisms. We can use a counter, which creates a definite counter-controlled loop, so how many times that loop is going to be executed. Or we can create a sentinel value loop, and that is considered an indefinite loop because it performs a different number of times based on a value that's provided by the user. So the user decides how many times that loop is going to execute. Looking at this first example, this provides an example of a definite counter loop. Our loop value is going to stop at 5. Here's our value. Well, actually, here's just a print line statement before the loop. Here's our while loop. We're going to test to see that x is less than the value inside of our stop loop variable. And if it is, then we'll go in here and we'll print out hello and then add 1 to our loop control variable. So this loop is going to run until x comes up to 5. And once x becomes 5, this statement evaluates to false. So it will exit out of our loop and continue on with the rest of our program. With a definite loop, we know how many times the loop is going to be run, but we still need to make sure that our loop control variables are altered. And one way that you'll see that happening is by using these counter plus plus or counter minus minus or whatever the name of the loop control variable is. And that just says add 1 to whatever that name of that variable is and make that the new value for that variable. So a little bit of shorthand. Our counter will typically start at 0 and add 1 to it each time the loop goes through. Counter variables, you'll often see them as I, J, C, count, counter, num of, count of. Those are all good variable names for counter variables. This example is just like the one earlier, except down here instead of x equals x plus 1, I've just used x plus plus, and that will increase x by 1 and store the new value inside of x. And then the loop will continue running. So a little bit shorter way to write that x equals x plus 1, just using x plus plus. If I wanted to decrease x, each time I could use minus minus, but on the flip side, if I do that, I would have an infinite loop because x would never reach the stop loop variable. Sometimes we don't know how many times our loop needs to run. It will depend on how many values the user enters in, so we can use an indefinite loop that is controlled with a sentinel value. The key to success with the sentinel value loop is that we must tell our user what the sentinel value is. So these are all examples of sentinel values that you might see in other programs. Again, just need to make sure that you set a value to be the sentinel value and let your user know what it is so that they can type in the correct sentinel value to exit out of the loop. If your programs do not tell me what the sentinel value is, you'll be asked to redo it so that I can get out of your programs. Here's an example that uses a sentinel value loop. I use a scanner and I set an end value variable to a string called end. And I say, welcome to the program, enter a word or the end value, which is end, to enter, or to end the program, so that my user knows what the magic word is that they have to type to get out of the program. I capture that, and then I check to see if the value is not what the user put in there. Then I'm going to print out hello, tell them to enter another word or the end value, and then prompt for that new value. With sentinel value loops, you need to be very mindful of your data type. So if your sentinel value loop takes in a double, you'll need to make sure that you get the double captured correctly and that you remove what else is on the line, depending on if you need to take in a string or something along those lines. It's also really important the order of things. So you need to have some sort of prompt going into your while loop so that you can check to see if the condition is true. And then once the condition is true and it gets in here and does whatever it wants or whatever it needs to do, you need to prompt them again. So typically this is the correct order that you'll see so that you don't end up with extra values inside of your calculations, either from the sentinel value adding in, or in the case where you're trying to collect values or something, you don't end up with a sentinel value inside of that. So be very mindful. You'll have to test this quite a bit to make sure that you get the order. But this is typically the order that will be successful 99% of the time. So prompt for some feedback before you go into the loop. Test to see that the value is good. Do whatever the loop needs you to do, and then prompt for a new value at the end of your loop. When you're working with while loops, you need to check for the big three. You need to make sure that you provide a starting value for your variable that will control the loop. You need to test the loop control variable, make sure that it's a good value and that the condition is true. And then inside that loop body, you need to alter the loop control variable so that your loop can change and you can potentially, or you can eventually get out of your loop. Let's look at for loops for a minute. For loops are a definite loop. They cannot use a sentinel value to end. So you'll have to know what that final value is before you start your for loop. It does three actions in one structure. So it initializes the loop control variable, it evaluates it to see if it's true or false, and then it alters it, all inside of that one line. Typically the body for a for loop is shorter because all that evaluation and altering all happens inside of the opening line of the for statement. Our for loop syntax starts with the initialization of our loop control variable, then what our test will be, and then finally it alters it. And typically our altering is just plus plus or minus minus to increase it by 1 or to step it up by 1 or step it down by 1. Again, opening up those curly brackets, statements inside of our for loop are going to end in our semicolon. However, after our final curly bracket for our for loop, it does not have a curly bracket. Here's an example of a for loop. I is our loop control variable. Make sure whenever you initialize that, you include the data type for it. You typically will not use for loops with strings, or you might use it with a double, but typically it's with an integer because you just want to step up each time by 1. Here's our check here. So as long as I is less than our stop loop variable, this for loop is going to run, and each time through we're going to add 1 to I. So this loop, I will start at 0 and it'll run until it's through 1, 2, and then once it reaches 3, this value becomes false and it will pop out of here and continue on. So this variable is initialized to I, and then it would perform our check, and if that check is good, it will do what's inside of the for loop. After it's done executing what's in between the curly brackets, that is when it increases I by 1. So then it would increase I to 1, it would do this check again, and if it's true, it would execute this. So it doesn't quite go hop, hop, hop right through it all, but instead it declares and initializes it, does the check, goes through the loop, and then increments your loop control variable. As I mentioned earlier, the changing of the loop control variable can be positive or negative. You can use the I++ or the I-, but usually the default value is 1 unless there's some reason why you need to go by evens or odds. So that you're not getting every value but every other value. Although this loop looks like a sentinel value loop, it's actually not. It's still a for loop. It's going to run a definite number of times. However, the value that is passed in from the user or comes from the user is stored inside of a user number variable, and that is the variable that we use to control our number of loops. So if the user enters in 3, this is going to run for 3 times. It'll run while I is 0, 1, and 2, and then it will exit out. So you still can use user input inside of your for loop. We'll just use the value inside of the variable that we set for them inside of our for loop. This example is going to count out from 0 to the user number, but what if we wanted to count down? We can also use input from our user to set the value for the loop control variable. So we could have it start at 3 and then work its way down to 0. So this is just another way to write that, except in this case it's going to go from 3 to 1, and then once it becomes 0, it'll exit out. So here's a way using these other operators and our plus plus minus minus that you can change and change the direction that the loop control variable is altered. A do while loop is just a different flavor on a while loop. With a do while loop, we have the keyword do, and it opens inside of curly brackets, and the statements that are inside of those curly brackets will execute at least once. After it's done executing, then it will test the condition to see if it's true. So in our case with a while loop, there's a chance that the condition may be false initially and it never gets into our loop. In the do while loop, it will always execute it at least once and then do the check to see if the condition is true. So in this example for our do while loop, it does what's inside of these 2 curly brackets. It'll print out hello and then increase the number of times variable by 1, and then it will perform the check to see if it's good. So in this case, if number of times was 10, it would come through here, it would print out hello, increase number of times to 11, and then our condition would become false. So it would automatically do what's inside of between these two curly brackets at least one time before it exits out of the loop. One common issue that I see inside of do-while loops is people will forget to alter the loop control variable. So in this case, this is an infinite loop, and it would continue to run because num of times is never altered. It's always 3. And if you get yourself into an infinite loop inside of Eclipse, and it's printing out or doing whatever and you can't get out of it, maybe your sentinel value is not set correctly, there is a red square up here that you can click. That's your kill switch. So once you click that, that'll kill your infinite loop and let you go back in there and edit it. So that's how you get out of infinite loops. Let's take a moment and flip over to Blackboard. I have some comments to make on the stuff this week to ensure that you get perfect scores the first time that you turn things in. Our topics this week are divided out by the different kinds of loops. So we'll pop into topic 1 first because I want to talk about quickly this last assignment down here at the very end, which is the ticket counter. This one typically trips students up, and it doesn't need to. The most common error that I see with the ticket counter assignment is that students trying to make that while loop too complex. It's a very simple while loop. Your tickets are going to, your ticket counter program is going to run until all the tickets have been sold. That's it. So you don't need to put a whole bunch of checks inside of your while loop condition. You're just going to check to see if there are tickets that are greater than 0. The trick of this one is inside of the body of the while loop. You will have to make a complex if statement to figure out if the tickets need to be reduced or not. So there'll be a couple ifs and else ifs in there before that check will happen. After your if statement, after you determine if the ticket transaction can happen or not, then you'll need to look at how many tickets are left, and that comparison will happen up there inside of your while loop. So this is one that's a little bit different than before. You're probably going to use that master loop control variable to see if there are tickets available, and if there are tickets available inside of that while loop, prompt them for how many they'd like to buy, look through the if statement, make sure that it's a valid amount that they can buy, deduct the amount of tickets that they've purchased from the total tickets available, and then your loop will do your check again to make sure that there are still tickets available so that you can prompt them again. So you'll need to play with this, you'll need to test it. One tip I have is you can see that no more than 75 tickets can be sold. While you're testing, drop that number down to like 10. Then you don't have to run through your loop as many times, but you can still check to make sure that your logic works. After you get your logic working for 10, it should be the same for 75. So then you can just modify your hint constant final variable to 75 instead of 10. I anticipate this, and it's completely normal for this project to take you quite a bit of time, especially if you've never worked with while loops before or thought about the logic of how that would happen in the order. So don't get frustrated, just get started early on your assignments so that you can start on this, sleep on it for a night, and then come back in there and finish it the next day. Topic 2 is for loops, and we have some practice through here, a couple of videos to watch, and then we're going to modify our online book order for a for loop. So we'll prompt the users for how many number of books they want to purchase, and then we'll use a for loop to gather the cost for each book. So this is sort of like the example that was provided earlier in the video. Also, do-while loops, pretty simple assignment in here with the do-while loops. If you make this program more than 4 to 5 lines, you've got too much going on. I should not see an if statement inside of this print stars assignment because the loop can handle it. Finally, sentinel value loops. Examples, we're going to modify the online book order to use a sentinel value. So you can read through here and make sure that you test this program very well, because a lot of times I will find that the number of books purchased is one too high, or the book subtotal is higher and it includes the sentinel value in there. So if that happens, you'll receive it back so that you can modify it and remove those components. So that's what we have going on in week 5. Again, just a little review down here of everything, so you can check your Blackboard gradebook and make sure that you've got scores in there for everything, or attempts in there, attempts in there for everything as well. If you have any questions, please let me know. You can ask any questions on that discussion board. If you get stuck, don't forget about that loop control kill switch if you end up with an indefinite loop. And make sure that you don't submit any of those indefinite loops to me, because as you know, as you saw in all of those comments back there, if you turn in a loop that doesn't end, you get no points for it. Make sure that you're very mindful that you turn in good loops with good loop control variables and good conditions. I hope you have a fantastic week and you don't go too crazy chasing yourself around in a loop. Have a good one.